Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. This is part 2 of the Classical School of Thought series. In the last video, we had looked at labor supply and labor demand according to the classicals. Both the labor supply and labor demand were function of real wages. Labor demand was negatively related to real wage and was downward sloping. Labor supply was positively related to the real wage and was upward sloping. We can use this information to see what the aggregate supply looks like. So let's get into it. What is aggregate supply? Aggregate supply shows the total output that firms will produce at different aggregate price levels. So we need to see how firms and workers react to a change in price level in order to find out how our aggregate supply looks like according to the classicals. Let us assume we start with an equilibrium position where labor supply is equal to labor demand. At L1, we have the equilibrium level of employment. Let P1 be the initial price and W1 be the initial wages at the equilibrium. Now let's assume that our price increases from P1 to 2P1. What will be the reaction of the firms and the workers? Since workers are only interested in real wages, clearly the new real wage is lower than what they had received initially. This means that they will supply less labor. On the other hand, labor demand will increase. Labor is demanded till the point where real wages or W by P is equal to the marginal productivity of labor or MPL. Since W by P is equal to MPL, it implies that W is equal to MPL into P. Since the price has increased from P1 to 2P1, it means that at the same wage rate, firms are now getting a higher return and therefore they will demand more labor. Thus, there is an excess demand over supply. The money wage will therefore start to rise to re-equilibrate the supply and demand in the labor market. That is, the wages should rise to 2W1. Thus, money wage will rise proportionately to a rise in the price. This is because if the rise in money wage is lower than what it was before, then the real wages would be lower than the initial wages and the workers will supply less labor. On the other hand, if the rise in wage is more than what it was before, the real wages will be greater, and while the workers may supply more labor, the firms will demand less labor. Thus, to re-equilibrate the supply and demand in the labor market, the wages have to rise proportionately to a rise in price. This also implies that our real wages will remain unchanged as your prices increase. This further implies that labor input remains unchanged as your real wages remains unchanged. And therefore, the output remains the same at any price level, ceteris paribus. Therefore, we can say that the aggregate supply will be a straight line parallel to y-axis. We can understand this further with the help of a graph. It will be a two-part graph. In the first part, let x-axis refer to employment or labor input. Let y-axis refer to the nominal wages. MPL into P1 is the initial labor demand curve. Initial labor supply curve is LSP1. When price increases to 2P1, the labor supply curve shifts inwards to LS2P1. Labor demand curve shifts rightwards to MPL2P1. At the unchanged wage W1, there will be an excess of labor demand, and this excess will be equal to L2 minus L2 dash. Thus, wages will rise till LS2P1 is equal to MPL 2p1. That is, the curves intersect. Similarly, if the price increased to 3p1, equilibrium will be re-established at the point where labor supply LS3p1 and labor demand MPL into 3p1 are equal. One thing that you would have noticed about this is that the level of employment remains unchanged at L1 when there's equilibrium. Therefore, in the second part of the graph, assuming that x-axis represents the output and y-axis represents the prices, since we have already established in the previous video that y is equal to f of k bar comma L, or output is a function of labor and capital, and labor has remained unchanged in response to the change in prices. Thus, here we will find that the output will also remain unchanged. Therefore, at prices P1, 2P1, 3P1, output remains unchanged at Y1. Connecting these points will give us AS, or the aggregate supply curve. This aggregate supply curve, as you can see, is parallel to y-axis. So now we've covered an integral part of a classical school of thought. Let's move on to how price is determined in the classical theory. For this, we need to understand the quantity theory of money. There are two different approaches to the quantity theory of money, but the implications of both the approaches are the same. First, let's understand the Fisher's approach to quantity theory of money. According to Fisher, the quantity theory of money is an equation of exchange which is an identity specifying the relationship between volume of transactions, money supply, and turnover rate for money. The turnover rate is the amount of times a dollar is used in transaction for a specified period of time. In other words, it is the number of times a money changes hand. This is also known as the velocity of money. The identity states that M into Vt is equal to Pt into T, or money supply into velocity at time period T is equal to the price at time T into the volume of total transactions during period T. The volume of transactions is roughly equal to aggregate output. Therefore, we can rewrite the identity as following: M into Vt is equal to Pt into Y, or M into Vt upon Y is equal to Pt. From this we can conclude the following. A. The price level varies directly with the change in money supply and the velocity of money. And B. It varies inversely with the volume of trade or output. Since payment habits and technology determine the velocity of money, we assume that it remains unchanged in the short run, since these are quite rigid in nature. This is not a very difficult point to understand. For example, let's look at UPI. UPI has been introduced in India for a long time, and although quite a lot of the population has adopted its usage, there are still some that prefer to make transactions using cash. Output, as we've seen before, is supply is determined, so it will also be constant in the short run. So now we have velocity that is constant and output that is constant in the short run. Thus, our identity will be transformed into M into V bar T upon Y bar is equal to PT, or in other words, money supply or quantity of money in the economy determines the price level. Now let's shift to the second approach to the quantity theory of money. This approach is the Cambridge approach. This focuses on individuals' decision to hold money. A person will hold money to carry out transactions, but at the same time it's important to remember that currency yields no return. Therefore, only a part of the income would be demanded as currency. Therefore, money demand would be a proportion of income. Money demand, or MD, is equal to K into P into Y, where K is the proportion of money that is held as currency, P is the price in the economy, and Y is the output that the economy produces. At equilibrium, money supply, which is determined exogenously, should be equal to money demand. Therefore, M is equal to MD, which is equal to K into P into Y bar. We are taking Y to be constant because, as we've already stated before, output is determined by supply side factors. Now we can compare this Cambridge equation with the Fisher's equation. Here, money supply is equal to K into P into Y bar. If we take K to the other side, we would have money supply into 1 by K is equal to P into Y bar. Now remember that Fisher's equation was money supply into velocity is equal to P into Y bar. Thus, comparing the two equations, one can confer that velocity is equal to 1 upon K. We can use this quantity theory of money to construct the classical aggregate demand. The aggregate demand curve will be a negatively sloping curve. This is because M into V is equal to P into Y. Now we have assumed that in the short run velocity is constant. We have also assumed that money supply is exogenously determined. This means that a left part side of the identity remains constant. So, if we change our prices, the output has to change in order to ensure that the total remains constant. So, if our price will increase, the output has to fall in order to maintain the identity. On the other hand, if our prices fall, then the output must rise in order to maintain the identity. Therefore, we can conclude that aggregate demand must be a downward sloping curve. Did you guys notice something about the aggregate demand in the classical school? Think. I'll give you some time. Aggregate demand in the classical school is an implicit theory. They don't outright talk about the aggregate demand. Instead, they use the quantity theory of money as a means to establish the relationship between price and output. As we have already seen, aggregate demand will be a downward sloping curve. So now we have our aggregate demand and our aggregate supply. Our aggregate supply is a straight line parallel to y-axis. Our aggregate demand is a downward sloping curve. In the next video, I'll be covering the factors that affect aggregate demand and aggregate supply. I also cover the policy implications of the classical theories. If you have any questions, do leave a comment and I'll try to answer. If you found this video helpful, please leave a like. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.